Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is David Parnell. David is a professor of history at Indiana University Northwest, and he's been on the podcast a few times now. And on one of these episodes, we talked about Belisarius and Antonina, and of course their great patron Justinian. And that's the Justinian who built Hagia Sophia. Anyway, today we're talking about another emperor of the same name, and this is Justinian II. And Justinian II, he comes to the throne about 135 years after the death of his more famous predecessor, but he has one of the most extraordinary careers of any Roman emperor. He was overthrown, he was mutilated, he was exiled right to the edge of his empire, and he came back with an army of steppe nomads to try and win back his throne. And it's such a good story that I'm frankly amazed nobody has made a film about it. Anyway, welcome back, David, to the podcast.
Thank you, Russell. It's a great honor to be back here again.
So when we discussed this topic a few months ago, you very kindly recommended that I read an historical novel to get a bit of background. And that's the novel by H.N. Turteltaub called Justinian. And I must say, I thought it was really good. And I actually then went and read a couple more of his books, which I thought weren't quite so good. But I thought his Justinian was excellent. So I thought we might loosely use the novel as a sort of roadmap for the discussion. So is that okay with you?
That sounds great. I think I should just point out for your listeners that H.N. Turteltaub, as you describe him, is a pen name. And under most of his other novels, he goes simply by Harry Turtledove. So that's worth noting if your listeners are trying to look up these books later.
And is Turtledove, is he the science fiction author?
Yes, he writes science fiction and historical fiction.
Oh, okay. Is he still going? Because I've just been very rude about his novels. Feeling bad about that now.
He is still going. He's no longer on X, formerly Twitter, as you and I are, but he is on Blue Sky if you want to follow him there.
Yeah, that's an honor I'll maybe... Anyway, let's move on. So look, before we go any further, I'll just tell the listeners we're going to split this podcast into two episodes because I think Justinian's life, it has, as you'll find out, it has a very natural split in the middle. So anyway, that's the plan. Okay, but so we should get started. So do you want to introduce him for us? I mean, who is this Justinian and what sort of empire has he been born into?
Sure. Justinian II is one of my favorite characters in what we call medieval Roman or Byzantine history. He's absolutely fascinating. I don't know how to sum him up because he's so complex, and that's what makes him interesting. He is incredibly pious, as many medieval Christians are. And we know this because he's the first Byzantine or Roman emperor to put Jesus Christ on his coins. We know that he is impetuous, that he's very confident. We know that he is eager to make his mark on the world because he becomes emperor at about the age of 16. And, when I think of what I was trying to do at 16 or what we dreamed of doing at 16, you can imagine, that this might lead to some impetuous arrogance on the part of a young emperor of 16 years old. Anyway, he becomes emperor in 685, and the empire he inherits from his father, Constantine IV, is much smaller than the Roman Empire at its heyday, much smaller than the empire of Justinian I. It sort of mostly focuses on what is today Turkey, a little tiny bit of what is today Greece, little bits of Italy, a corner of North Africa, pieces here and there. It's very small, but it is compact, and it is an empire that has been ruled by his family for 4 generations by this point. So Justinian II is the great-great-grandson of Heraclius, who had led the fight against first the Persians and then the Arabs in their initial onslaught. So he is the final representative of this Heraclian dynasty. And I think that's a good enough introduction to get us started, at least.
I was surprised, certainly, when I looked and saw that. I sort of assumed that Greece was sort of part of the Byzantine heartlands, and it turns out that actually they don't control most of Greece. They have some of the big cities, but large parts of it have been taken over by various ne'er-do-wells.
Yes, yes. So as a result of Heraclius focusing so much on fighting the Persians in his reign at the beginning of the 7th century, the Danube frontier was breached and was never recovered. So what we have is a situation in the early to mid 7th century where waves of non-Romans, the Romans would call them barbarians, were crossing the river and settling and taking over lands in first the northern part of the Balkans by the Danube, but then eventually all the way down into Greece itself. And most of these people were generically called Slavs, and they took over most of Greece except for the coastlands. So Thessaloniki, and then some cities to the very south part of Greece and the Peloponnese remained in Roman control. But a lot of this region was lost to the empire, and it wouldn't become Heartland again for a couple hundred years.
Okay. And so when the book opens, I guess it's good opening the book. It sort of opens very dramatically with a young Justinian. He's standing on the walls of Constantinople and he's looking out at a sea. You know, it's a bit like something out of Helm's Deep at in the Lord of the Rings movie. There's sort of sea of besieging armies. So this is the great Arab siege. Do you want to just tell us a bit about the siege?
Yeah, sure. So the Arab siege of Constantinople, there's several. This is the first one. It's traditionally dated to about 674 or so. And that's why in the novel, the author has the young Justinian looking out at it as about 5 years old. It's actually been more recently redated to be perhaps around the time Justinian II was born, the 667, 668 time period. So maybe the historical Justinian didn't actually do this as he does in the novel, but it makes a very, evocative opening scene, as you point out.
Yeah.
So the Arabs have sent both an army, which has traveled overland all the way through Anatolia and is now encamped on the other side of the Bosporus from Constantinople, and they've sent a fleet. And the fleet has come and sort of surrounded the waterways around Constantinople, the Golden Horn there. And this would continue for a couple of years, at least, with the Arabs sort of creating a winter base on the Anatolian side of the straits. And so when the winter comes, their ships would go back. When the summer comes, their ships would come back in and continue the siege. And it was a serious attempt to take Constantinople that Constantine IV, Justinian II's father, as a young emperor, had to sort of hold back the best he could. And he did. They survived. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be talking about this story because Justinian II would have never had a reign if the Arabs had succeeded at this siege.
But was success a serious possibility, or is I always do this. I start one question and I go on to another one. But is this when they sort of wheel out Greek fire and cause all sorts of trouble?
Yes. This is the moment that Greek fire is introduced as a weapon, and much to the surprise of the Arabs. And we don't know the exact circumstances around the creation of this weapon. And we definitely don't know the exact composition of the weapon and how it was made. That was a carefully guarded state secret. And it died with the state. We don't have it anymore. But we do have the reaction to what happened. And it's this napalm-like substance, this sort of jelly that can be fired out of essentially a water gun, a cannon, and then lit as it's fired. And then it sort of burns brightly, and it burns on wood, and it burns on ground, and it burns on water because it's oil based of some sort. So it's a devastating weapon, particularly when used against ships on sea in a confined location where you have them all sort of stacked together, and that just happens to be exactly what the Bosporus is. So this Arab fleet is stacked up, and the Byzantine ships are able to row out and then point these water guns at it and fire this napalm jelly, this Greek fire, and then burn them all up. And they're especially horrified to find that water doesn't put out the fire, and the fire floats on the water and goes to other ships, and it's quite a disaster. I think the novel sort of evocatively captures the confusion that must have been the result of this new weapon.
But it's not just the Greek fire. I mean, the walls of Constantinople, they're absolutely magnificent. And, I just wonder, it must have been terribly hard for the Arabs to maintain an army through winters and really have a chance of conquering it. I mean, I do slightly wonder if they might have been better just nibbling at the empire bit by bit rather than trying to go for, a killer knockout blow. So is there method in their madness, or what do you think?
Well, that's a great question, and probably a better question for a historian of the early medieval Arabs than for me. But I'll do my best to answer it, because what I think is happening here, and maybe you'll have a specialist later that will correct me, but I think what's happening here is ideologically driven strategy planning by the Arabs. They see it as their destiny to knock out the Romans, to destroy Constantinople. And they correctly identify this as really the only remaining serious opposition or threat to what they're doing in the Mediterranean basin. So if they could do this, then everything else is a cakewalk. Everything else is easy. So I think motivated by their belief that God wants them to do this, that they are inspired by God and what they're doing, they see just going for the straight knockout blow, get Constantinople, get it done, and then everything else will fall afterwards. I think that's what's motivating them, perhaps more than the sort of rational, cold-blooded strategy you're advocating of slowly advancing and securing that advancement and then advancing a little more and that sort of thing.
Right. And I suppose if you do nibble a bit, then when the Byzantines recover, they can always come back and nibble straight back at you. I don't know.
As happens, yes, that is how it actually unfolds.
Oh. So Justinian, he becomes emperor. You said he's 16 when he becomes emperor. Does he take over full power, or does he have sort of somebody standing behind him to tell him what to do, or is he straight into the job?
He is straight into the job. There's no regency council. There's no formal advisory group that we can identify. His father is, of course, dead. We know his mother is still alive, and so it's possible that she tries to exercise some sort of influence over him. But in Roman culture at this time, when you're 16, you're an adult.
Right.
You're able to answer for yourself. And it just so happens that this is not unusual. All of his father, Constantine IV, his grandfather, Constans II, both of them had come to the throne as teenagers. So this is seen sort of as standard for the family, right? Once you're a teenager, you're a precocious young lad. You're ready to go. Why don't you go ahead and lead this empire?
How good is he at the job? My impression was that he's actually moderately successful at the start. He seems to have some decent campaigns. I don't know. It seemed to not go too badly.
Yes, I think that's accurate to say. I should say before we get into his successes that a lot of our imagery, a lot of our knowledge of Justinian II is shaped by the excesses of his second reign and the way that the sources write about those. So the common perception of Justinian II, if there is one, is that he's a sort of arrogant and mad emperor who's not very successful. But, when you look at these first few years of his reign, he does seem to have some good ideas. He does what a Byzantine emperor should do. He fights against enemies, both east and west, relatively successfully. He organizes a religious council of the Christian church that approves the Orthodox faith and advances it in various ways. He gets married and has a child, which is expected of you if you're the emperor. So he seems to be doing the kind of things he should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
So we could talk about some or all of those things, but I think he's if not a model emperor, he is living up to expectations, and he's establishing that he has the possibility to turn into a very good emperor within those first few years.
One thing he seems very keen on is resettling people in the sort of the depopulated bits of the empire, because he manages to sort of tough up the Slavs, as I understand it, and those, he just uproots their villages and carts them off to Anatolia. Is that about right?
Yes. Yeah. This is maybe one of his more interesting defining features, and something that will become maybe a little more common after him, but really wasn't something that previous emperors showed much interest in. But Justinian II does like to resettle people. He sort of sees people as these these interchangeable blocks that he can move around his empire to sort of fill in holes where they're needed. So, he does this twice in his first reign. First, as you point out, he leads this campaign into what today we call Greece against the Slavs, and he manages to march from Constantinople to Thessaloniki, which no emperor has done for, I don't know, a couple of generations at this point, because it's not been open to them. It's been covered by these Slavs. So he marches through, he defeats any military opposition, and he rounds up thousands of these Slavs. At minimum, probably something like 50,000 people are rounded up, and then they are taken and transported over the strait and settled in Anatolia, probably in the sort of northwestern corner of Anatolia there. And then, not too long after that, he fights a campaign against the Arabs on the borders of Anatolia. And as a result of the campaign during the peace treaty, the Arabs ask him to remove some warriors from the areas just north of Lebanon and ship them somewhere else so that they're not going to be threatening the Arabs anymore. And he does this, and he moves those warriors, known as the Mardaites, probably all the way over to the Balkans and sort of plugs them in there, maybe where the Slavs used to be. So he's shifting peoples around in a way that makes sense from a macro sort of big picture level. And, those listeners of yours who like to play, strategy video games where you can just sort of move pieces around on the board or tabletop board games, right? Like, this makes sense to us from a strategic perspective, but, it's sort of not paying attention to the feelings of the individuals involved who may not necessarily have enjoyed their forced resettlement en masse.
No, I don't suppose they did. So you mentioned that he got married and that he had a child. And one thing about the novel, it's all a bit cringe-making. It had a lot of sex scenes in it. And at times, it read almost like a sort of an instruction manual for inquisitive young boys to know what to do. Personally, I prefer the Bernard Cornwell approach to historical writing, which is, none of that kind of thing whatsoever. But one thing that was very interesting to me was that when Justinian marries, is it Eudokia? There's a kind of a public ritual on the wedding night, which is people are cheering them into the bedroom. It's a very public sort of occasion when they go into the bedroom, and then afterwards he comes out and he triumphantly shows off the bloodstained sheets, sort of proving that they've consummated the marriage, and I guess virginity as well. And I was puzzled by that because I sort of associated these sort of bedding ceremonies with later times, and the idea that a Roman emperor would be called upon to do this, it just struck me as incredibly undignified.
Yes, it's a very interesting and evocative scene in the novel, which I guess is meant to sort of show us his transition to more settled manhood, I suppose, right, from his earlier dalliances as a boy. And I think it's very difficult to know whether Justinian personally had this kind of thing happen to him. The author has created this scene based probably primarily on knowledge of later traditions, as you indicate. But that doesn't mean it's impossible that this could have happened to Justinian or to Byzantines like him at this period. So we know that as early as the 200s, there was a tradition of giving a speech at the wedding chamber, if you will. So this is separate from the actual wedding ceremony where, of course, there's the pronouncing of the vows, and then you probably have a speech like in praise of the bride and the groom. There's a tradition of giving a speech outside the door of their wedding chamber, which the speech is meant to sort of refer less to love and more to sort of the physical act of consummation. So we know that there are people that are potentially assembled to hear this speech. We don't know the timing of it, though. So is it happening sort of before the consummation? Is it happening after the consummation? And the speeches include some description of let's see the evidence, in other words. So
Yeah.
that's a possibility that something like a bedsheet is brought out. But all of this is a little bit hazy for this very early period. And even if it's a known rhetorical exercise that people might give these speeches, it's not necessarily clear if this is happening in every marriage, especially in an imperial marriage, or not. So I think the author takes a little bit of artistic license there in painting that scene. It may have happened that way, and it may not.
I mean, I guess for people like Henry VIII, I don't know if they did this for Henry VIII, but for him, consummation was a critical legal matter because the wedding wasn't valid. The marriage wasn't complete until there was consummation, and he could still get a divorce if he could, persuade the Pope, which he couldn't, that the marriage was imperfect. But in Byzantine marriage, was consummation a significant part of the story?
Not for legal purposes, as you're alluding to there with Henry VIII, but I think there is a concern for the Byzantines as well as the Romans that the bride have her virginity intact, that this could be demonstrated in some way, maybe not necessarily publicly like that, but that the groom would be satisfied that the bride's virginity was intact. And this is primarily for the purposes of guaranteeing legitimacy of offspring. So it's not so much proving to the Pope that you've consummated the marriage, but can I be certain that the child born 8 to 9 months from now is mine, rather than potentially somebody that my now wife slept with the week before, right? So from that situation, I think proof of virginity on the wedding night matters.
Then he does the thing you're not supposed to do, which he starts a land war in Asia, this time against the Arabs. And it seems like absolute madness because his father, which I don't really understand, and I need you to explain this, but his father's managed to negotiate a tribute from the Arabs, and I'd always thought it would be the other way around. And then Justinian, by causing them a little bit of trouble, he's managed to sort of twist their arms and get a bit more tribute. And now he thinks, well, now we're going to really take them on. I'm just thinking, what was he thinking? And more to the point, how does it go?
This is a feature of Justinian's character. He's just always ambitious. He always believes he can get a little bit more. So the first treaty signed by his father, Constantine IV, was probably signed as a result of the Byzantine success in withstanding that first Arab siege, right? They'd been able to repulse the Arab attack on Constantinople. The Arabs eventually retreated in disgrace back across Anatolia, back to Syria. And when they did that, it caused convulsions in the caliphate because they'd, of course, as I'd mentioned to you, they'd done this sort of ideologically. They believed they were destined to do this. They'd failed. So there was some dispute in the caliphate, which we don't need to get into in detail here. There's unrest. There's the potential for rebellion. And so to focus on his internal affairs, the caliph had promised Constantine IV a very small subsidy and a peace treaty. Mm-hmm. So that's the situation that Justinian inherits. The peace treaty itself says that the Byzantines will get 3,000 numismata, 3,000 gold coins, 50 horses, and 50 slaves per year, which is relatively a nominal kind of thing for empires of this scale. So it's not a huge tribute, but it's some sort of something that recognizes that the Byzantines had the upper hand at the moment and the Arabs needed the peace. So when Justinian becomes emperor, he thinks he can do better than this. So this is probably the result of intelligence he's receiving that the Arabs are still sort of racked with convulsions and potential civil wars of their own. So he sends his army against the Arabs. As you say, he starts a land war in Asia. He wins some victories, and he gets a new treaty out of them. And this is an improved treaty because instead of 3,000 gold coins for the whole year, he gets 1,000 gold coins every week.
Gosh.
Out of the Arabs. So, it's a substantial increase in the emperor's coffers from this war. So it works out. So, as you point out, like he already had a good deal, but he thought he could get a better deal. And it turns out he was right. So I do have to wonder if that just sort of encouraged him to then try again,
Yeah.
because that's what he does about 3 years later. He tries yet again, even though he's already got the better deal that his father had. He's got a pretty good deal. All he has to do is do nothing and collect this money. But he's overconfident because this is after his campaign in the Balkans against the Slavs that we mentioned earlier. And as a result of that campaign, he resettled all those Slavs in Anatolia, and the men of military age he formed into a fighting regiment, which he perhaps rather foolishly left as a single group under a Slavic chieftain instead of sort of breaking up and distributing in the Byzantine army. So he gets excitable about this army, which allegedly numbers 30,000 Slavs. And he thinks this is a real dagger. I could just stab this into the heart of the caliphate, and I'll either get more land or I'll get even better deal than I currently have. Mm-hmm. So he launches yet another war against the caliphate. And this one finally does not go well. Not surprisingly, the special army of the Slavs is quickly identified by the Arab commander as, hey, this isn't a normal Roman army. What are they doing here? And so he sends an emissary and manages to bribe them to switch sides, which they happily do because they're not terribly loyal to Justinian II after he's resettled them from their homelands anyway. So the Slavs move over to the Arabs, and then the Romans lose this battle, the Battle of Sebastopol in 692. And Justinian loses the tribute that he was receiving and doesn't get any more tribute out of the Arabs for the rest of his reign.
And what's his role? Because he was present at at least according to the book, he's present at the battle. And what's his role? Because I think if Trajan would have been there, I don't really know, but I always assume Trajan is there sort of pointing out where everyone has to stand and what they're to do. Does he sort of act as on the ground general, or is he just there as a spectator? What's his role?
Yeah. So I don't know that Justinian was there historically. Our details about how that campaign unfolded are not very detailed. They're very vague. So I think for the purposes of the novel, he's there because he's our point of view in the novel. So he has to be there for something to get sort of reported in the novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think if Justinian was present for a campaign, and we know if he wasn't there for this one, he was present for other ones that we know he went on personally, like against the Bulgars later in his reign.
Yeah.
He probably is not giving all of the sort of specific commands that sort of an earlier emperor like Trajan might have done, or even his great-grandfather, Heraclius.
Right.
Because those individuals came up through the army. They were soldiers first. They were generals first before they became emperors. And Justinian has done none of that. That's the downside of becoming emperor at 16. You don't have any life experience before you become emperor. So he doesn't have any military experience. Now, that doesn't mean he gives zero orders, right? We can envision him being like, well, we're going to set out and you're going to go do this. But the day-to-day and the specific minutiae are left to his generals.
Yeah, he's sort of more the ideas man and sort of more the bad ideas man.
Hey, sometimes he has got good ideas, right? We got to give him credit. Sometimes it works out.
Yeah, I don't want to fall into line with the later sources. You're right. So there's two things that sort of come out of that battle which are quite interesting. I mean, one is, again, according to the book, but I think there's something in this. You'll tell me, some part of the army of the Slavs, either nobody's told them to desert or they don't want to desert. But anyway, they march back with Justinian and they stay loyal. And he then repays them, rather badly.
Yeah, so in the novel, he's filled with rage at the treason of the Slavic Special Army, as he sees it. And he returns with them, giving no indication that he's upset. And then when he gets to the lands they've been settled in, he has them rounded up with their women and their children. He kills all of them. This horrible massacre. So this is based partly in the reality of the sources we have, which do describe that Justinian was enraged after this and that he punished some of the Slavs that he could get his hands on. However, there's no indication that he killed all of them, the way the novel sort of implies. because there are still Slavic sort of communities within the northwestern part of Anatolia. In the next generations, we have not necessarily written literature about them, but we have these little sort of seals that were used to sort of stamp letters that are, say things like, I am the Count of the Slavs in this town. So we know that they were still there and were still being supervised in succeeding generations. So he didn't wipe them all out, but clearly something happened. Some kind of punishment was meted out. And we're left to sort of imagine what that was. Somewhere between nothing and slaughtering all of them is where it happened. And where in that continuum, I guess, depends on how much you want to give Justinian credit here.
Well, I mean, yeah, it didn't seem very credible to me. I don't think I've ever heard of such a thing in Roman history, but who knows? And then the other person who sort of, it's not just the Slavs that get the blame for all this. It's his general Leontius, if I'm pronouncing that right, who's sort of blamed for having mucked it all up, and he flings him in prison and chucks away the key, which I thought was was an extremely odd decision because, wouldn't it be safer just to execute the man rather than leave him sort of brooding angrily in a dungeon?
Russell, I've thought about this, and it's not the imprisoning part that bothers me. It's what comes next, and that is that he releases Leontius from prison and appoints him the general of a different region of the empire, and then just expects him to go off and serve loyally there after he's been in prison for several years. That's the part that really baffles me. I don't know what our emperor was thinking of there. But as far as the imprisonment goes, I think we have to understand that Justinian is a pious man. He's very religious. And as far as we can tell, the first reign, he's actually very reluctant to execute individuals for something that they've done that are inappropriate. So I kind of wonder if this is actually religiously based, that he sees it as his job as a good Christian ruler to not kill, but to find other ways of punishing / rehabilitating sinners as a Christian king would see them. And in fact, this is the basis of the Byzantine system of mutilation, which we might talk about later with regards to Justinian.
Who knows?
It's that if you mutilate somebody, you cut off a hand, you put out their eyes, you cut off their nose, you're keeping them alive so they can consider sort of their sins and they can have time to repent. Whereas if you cut their head off, if you kill them, well, their life's obviously over then. There's no time for them to reflect and repent and to potentially become, right with God before their death. They're just gone. So I kind of wonder if that's part of the reason for this inclination Justinian seems to have in his first reign towards imprisonment rather than execution.
Right. In the book, they say, this is such a terrible place to go to. He's sure to be killed, Leontius. But I thought that was extremely weak. But anyway, Leontius is sent off, to some special command. So what happens next?
Yeah, so the special command is actually connected to Justinian's campaign against the Slavs. So this is very poorly recorded, but sometime after he defeated the Slavs between Constantinople and Thessaloniki, he sets up a military command, a theme of Hellas, of Greece, which there hasn't been one before because they haven't controlled enough of Greece to need one since the reign of Heraclius and everything going to hell in a handbasket. So this is a new command on sort of what is now a Wild West frontier for the empire. And Justinian gets in his head that Leontius, even though he failed him against the Arabs, that this would be a good sort of just punishment or a way for him to sort of prove himself, in this new command on this far-flung western region. So he sends to Leontius, says, okay, you're going to be general of Hellas. And Leontius, according to our sources, is despondent because he believes that this is, a terrible position to be given him, and he's sure to be killed by some Slavs or something like that. So he has two friends that have been visiting him in prison. And they say to Leontius, well, if you don't want to go to Hellas, why don't you just be emperor? And Leontius, doesn't seem to know exactly how to do this. I think the novel captures that aspect of his character well. But these two friends are more ambitious and more cunning, come up with a plan for him. And the plan is actually a ridiculous one on its face, but it works. So I guess we can't call it ridiculous, having worked in retrospect. Leontius and his two friends, instead of going to the ship to set sail for Hellas and his new command, they go back to the prison and they knock on the door, and his men shout, "The emperor demands access." And whoever the damn fool is in the prison hears this, just assumes that it's Justinian, and opens the door. And then Leontius and his two friends bust in and knock the guy over the head, and they liberate all the people in the prison. So this gives them sort of a ready-made group. I mean, not very large, but a body of men that they can then sort of run around together. And they run through the streets with this body of men sort of waving swords around and saying, "Everybody go meet at the church." And so thousands of people converge on Hagia Sophia, and Leontius gives a brief speech, and then somebody shouts that he's the emperor. And then the patriarch is produced from within the church, and he very agreeingly pronounces that this is the day the Lord has made, and Leontius is our new emperor. And then everybody just starts running through the streets of Constantinople, shouting, "Dig up Justinian's bones," which is a Byzantine contemporary saying for, something horrible to do to somebody you really don't like. Digging somebody's bones up doesn't sound very nice. So there's a popular revolt against Justinian, and it's the middle of the night when this happens. So he is captured in the palace without the chance to resist, and he is deposed. And all of a sudden, Leontius, from being appointed general of Hellas from 3 years in prison, has suddenly become the emperor, and Justinian is on his way out.
And what I don't understand about that, well, one of the many things I don't understand about that story is why doesn't Justinian simply whistle up the Praetorian Guard and crush this before it gets going? Our emperor is not properly looked after.
Yes, it's a good question, and you have to be a little concerned in this period, not just with Justinian, but this is going to happen, 6 or 7 more times in the next 20 years. This is a sequence of events beginning here with the downfall of Justinian, which is going to be repeated for other emperors for the next 20 to 30 years. It's a very unstable time in the empire's history. The emperor does have bodyguards. It's no longer the Praetorian Guard. They're now known as the excubators. But he has bodyguards. So what's happening with them? Why are they not helping? And the only thing you can assume is they have been sort of suborned. They have been bought off by the rebel, or by some quick action. The rebels are acting before there's a chance for the excubators to get called together and to be organized in a proper way. It's very difficult to tell over the long centuries that separate us from these events, right? Like, how compressed were these events? How quickly did Leontius and his friends move to do all of this? If they moved very quickly, maybe there's not time for news of the revolt to spread, the emperor to learn of it, the emperor to assemble the excubators, all of his guards, line them up in a nice box to sort of protect him, right? Maybe it just all moves too quickly. But you're right to ask questions, because there are questions about this. Like, how could this have happened?
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting you say about the sources are a bit unclear, because actually something you said right at the start, which was that we don't quite know what the date of the Arab siege was. I mean, that sort of gives you some idea of how lousy our sources must be if if they didn't even bother to make a note in their diaries, that there was an Arab army, ready to wipe them out.
Yes, yeah, and we can go down this rabbit hole if you'd like. I don't know how much you want to go down it, but our sources for Justinian II date largely to 100 years or more after his reign.
Gosh.
We're looking at sources that were written much later. Now, we believe that they were written based on sources that were written much closer to his reign.
Sure.
But, the fact remains that the common source from the close period is gone, and we only have these sources that are from later, who are a little fuzzy on some of the details.
Why do we lose the sources from Byzantium? Because you would have thought that, Byzantium survives down to whatever it is, 1453 or whenever, if that isn't when Columbus sailed, I can never remember. Anyway, around about then. And you would have thought that the sources would get better and better compared to say Western Roman Empire.
Yeah, this is a question that sort of vexes us Byzantine historians when we're trying to figure it out. So there is a sense that there is sort of a dark age of Byzantine historiography where things are perhaps going so poorly in the empire that there just aren't as many historians writing as there are at other periods. So that's one potential answer. But of course, the much more general answer is just that in order for sources to survive to our day, you have to have people who care about them enough to read them and then painstakingly recopy them by hand. Or, of course, the manuscripts that they're written on just disintegrate over time. So there's the possibility that there were more people writing here in the reign of Justinian II, but that when those later chroniclers, 100 years later, sort of did their bigger overview chronicles and included that material in there, that people thought, well, why would I bother recopying, the first guy when the second guy, he's got a much better sort of systematic overview. I could just recopy him and then not worry about that one. So some scribal choice made in Constantinople in the year 1000 to recopy this chronicle from 800, but not this history from 700, that could very well explain why some things just don't survive. And it's not having to do with the quality of them. It's just what some guy in some monastery who had to decide which manuscript to recopy in his time he had, he made that choice.
So now we should get to one of the sort of the most famous episodes of Justinian's reign, which is how they make sure that he's never going to come back and cause trouble again. So what's their solution? Yeah,
so Justinian is captured alive by the partisans of Leontius, and he's brought to the hippodrome and thrown down at Leontius's feet. And the whole of the population that can fit in the hippodrome are there, and they're cheering for Leontius, their new emperor. They're shouting, "Dig up Justinian's bones." And everybody's looking for Leontius to decide.
No, sorry. When we say they're saying dig up Justinian's bones, is that just some general unpleasantness, or are they saying dig up Justinian's the First's bones? I'm a bit confused.
Oh, yes. No, this is just a general unpleasantness. This is like a curse you whisper, you wish upon your enemies. But yeah, you're right. It doesn't make total sense to us because we imagine this refers to somebody who's already dead and interred. Yeah. But no, this is a local colloquial saying you do to somebody who's alive, right? This is just saying like, to hell with him kind of thing.
Right.
That's what the statement means. So they are talking about Justinian II, not Justinian I bones, but it's a good question to ask for clarification. So Leontius has to decide what to do, and surely he has advisors whispering in his ear, just kill Justinian, let's get this over with, kill him, you're the emperor now. But Leontius can't quite bring himself to do this. And the reasons for that are probably varied. The sources tell us that Leontius had regard for Justinian's father, because Leontius had been a general for a long time. He'd served Constantine IV as well as Justinian II. So the sources tell us that his heart was softened by memories of Constantine IV. He couldn't bring himself to kill Constantine's son, so he didn't want to kill him. Also, the possibility that Leontius, like Justinian, is very pious and doesn't want Justinian's blood on his hands in that sense. Of course, he'll get his blood in another way. So what Leontius decides to do is a judicial mutilation, because it is widely believed, and Justinian will later prove this untrue, that an emperor who is not physically perfect cannot hold the throne, because the emperor represents sort of God on earth, and at least the imperial propaganda that emperors like to spit out. Therefore, as God is sort of perfect, the emperor has to at least be physically whole, right? So this is the idea behind why a eunuch can't be the emperor, because they're not physically whole. So Leontius decides to render Justinian ineligible through this judicial mutilation, and he chooses to cut off his nose, rhinocopia in the Greek, and to cut out his tongue, glossotomia in the Greek. So he's gonna cut off his tongue and his nose, and this will make Justinian ineligible to rule again because he's no longer physically whole. It also would make it very difficult for him to plan to return to rule again since he can't talk to anybody. So that's the plan. So right there in the hippodrome in front of everybody else, Justinian's nose is sliced off, his mouth is pried open, and the executioner sticks a knife in there and attempts to cut his tongue out, which he must fail at to some degree because there's no indication later in his life that Justinian is incapable of talking. In fact, he seems to talk quite a lot to people. So that part of the mutilation apparently didn't go as planned. But the nose is definitely gone.
Right.
And Justinian is then exiled because you don't want him hanging around, even if he has no nose. He's exiled to Kherson, which is in today's Crimea, which used to be a part of Ukraine, is today occupied by Russia. So he's shipped off to the far end of the Black Sea to live out the rest of his days there, and I guess think about his sins as emperor.
Okay, so it's off to exile to the far shores of the Black Sea, and as I said earlier, this just seems to be this is sort of part one of Justinian's stories. So I think it makes sense to end part one of the podcast here. And if you think it's been eventful up to now, then just wait for part two. Anyway, until then, Professor David Parnell, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Russell. I look forward to part two.